Good morning. My name is Mike Kenny. I'm the director of the Bennett School for Public Policy at Cambridge University, and I'm a professor of public policy at the university here. Today, I'm going to be giving you a recorded version of the talk that I would have given had I been able to join you in Galway. I'm afraid circumstances have conspired to mean that that isn't possible, which I'm really sorry about. You can see on this slide, and also I'll put it on the slide at the end, my email address. And I would be really open to anyone who has any further questions or inquiries or suggestions of things that points I should have thought about or so on. Please do get in touch. I'd be very, very happy to hear from you. So today I'm going to be talking about delivery and the question of why and delivery has become such a challenging issue for many different governments. Obviously, the focus here in particular is Ireland, and you'll all be familiar with arguments which link the failure to deliver or to implement policies in a sort of sufficiently narrow window in an appropriate timescale. That's kind of failure has been linked in a lot of discussion to growing citizen distrust, and that's become a sort of focus of much debate. But so also, I think more generally, is the question of why it is that governments in different parts of the world, particularly in democracies, seem to be struggling to deliver some of the basic social and economic goods that their populations expect. And as you will well know, there's been a lot of focus on what are the impediments to delivery. Are they institutional in kind, or is there something about the capabilities, the skill sets within governments that need to be addressed in relation to that question? So that's the backdrop to the specific brief I've got here, which is to start with a discussion of the focus in the three pillars framework set out by the Irish Civil Servants Management Board in 2024, which includes as one of its pillars a focus on feasibility and implementation. Now, I'll start with a specific discussion of that pillar, the framework in which it sits, and do some basic points of comparison with some other sort of programs for developing the policy profession in different countries. And then I'll pull out from that discussion to link what I take to be the focus and the rationale behind this focus on implementation in the Irish context with this bigger, more difficult debate, which, as I say, is happening pretty much everywhere around delivery. The three pillars framework, I'm sure you're all broadly familiar with it, has as its core three areas of focus, feasibility and implementation, which I've mentioned, as well as improvements in the area of evidence provision and analysis, and also citizen engagement. Just a couple of points to start with, observations from outside the Irish context about this particular framework. It seems to me that there is a really important and valuable insight which flows into this particular piece of work, which is the need to emphasize these different areas, all of which are clearly critical in the development of successful policy programs, coherent programs, and programs that also are feasible in their design. And I think what's striking and welcome about it in particular is that I think there's a kind of attempt here to bring together some of the different core functions of government and to improve the potential for connectedness and working across different silos by encouraging all different parts of the policy profession to upskill in those areas, to think harder about them, and also to consider at what points in the policy process those different elements have been incorporated. I think in terms of a vision that's animating this framework, the vision of the policy profession that is very striking here is a very inclusive one. the focus is quite deliberately on actually encouraging many different people in sitting in different functional roles across the Irish civil service to feel that they are part of a policy profession that is engaged in the core tasks of policy development. And that, as I'll suggest in a moment, is actually quite a distinguishing feature, I think, of this particular framework. I also am struck by the sense of balance that's being recommended here between these different elements, which are well, typically thought about entirely separately, and also the focus on integrating them, bringing them together so that policy is designed in a way that is tested out through engagement with citizens, whilst also being designed in a way that meets some of the challenges around implementation, the alliances that need to be forged, the forms of engagement that are important to implementation, but also looking forward to the development of appropriate forms of monitoring and indeed evaluation and feeding those findings back into the development of policy. I mean, this is a kind of ideal, typical description, of course, often it's not easy or possible to include all of those elements, but it seems to me exactly the right kind of overall architecture to envisage. I think there's an interesting question here about what's the sort of backdrop to this in the Irish context. I'll touch on that a bit further on in this talk. What are the perceived strengths and weaknesses of the Irish governmental machine? Been a number of official reports and also external commentary that have highlighted some successes in terms of crisis management and responding to some very immediate challenges, as opposed to the difficulties that the Irish governmental machinery has found in building the right kind of muscle to tackle longer term complex policy challenges like housing, you'll all be familiar with, or indeed climate change. There could many others besides. And I think the challenge here, which I certainly see from work I've done with many other democratic governments, is to try to bridge the gap between the thinking that goes into the sort of high level design of public policy and then the kind of messy realities of delivery on the ground. And that I'm sure is a challenge in Ireland, just as it is in many other places. These are challenges that are, of course, being felt everywhere, and everywhere, I think, is in a similar way to Ireland, trying to articulate its different approaches or do a kind of distinctive vision of what is the right kind of capability that needs to be housed within central government in order to address these different kinds of policy challenge. And I think it's worth highlighting some of by way of comparison, some of the distinguishing features of the three pillars framework that you've developed here in Ireland. So I think it is a striking feature that the sense here of accountability, which is often in many other governments, I think, is often linked to different specialist function. Here, I think, quite a deliberate attempt to suggest that almost everyone should feel responsible for policies that they are a part of developing. So there's a different sense of where accountability for policy, both for failure and success, is going to lie. And that's, I think, worth noting as something that is quite distinctive here. I think potentially there's a different approach here in the Irish context, in the context of the three pillars framework, to the view that's taken of specialist and technical functions, of those kind of support functions or particularly technically focused aspects of government delivery. For instance, it could be IT provision, it could be comms, which are often in other governments seen as somewhat separated out from the policy development function. And there's an interesting question here whether this model, this more inclusive model, will work when it comes to dealing with the variety of the different kinds of external stakeholders and veto players that present themselves in relation to complex policy challenges like developing infrastructure, delivering big infrastructure projects, and including housing. Other governments, as you I'm sure know, have taken a different approach to the vision of who is at the core of the policy profession and how it should be developed. Just to give a case that I know very well, which I think does take a different approach here, which is the UK government, which actually it sees the policy profession as one of four different professions that are occupying the central government space. And the focus is on a smaller subset of the civil service colleagues who are involved in the policy development function, sort of somewhat separated out from others. And for those who are part of the policy profession, it has developed a competency framework which has within it three pillars, which are labeled democracy, strategy, delivery. So some similarities, some overlap there with your own three pillars approach, but also some interesting difference in particular around strategy, which I'll come back to later. And then just to pick another example, just an example I've been engaging with a little bit of late, which I think is a very different example, a different country context entirely, of course, but I think has evolved a rather different approach to its strategy around central government capability, and that's the Finnish government, which adopts a rather different approach to policy development, probably more somewhere between the UK and Irish models in terms of who's included within the policy profession, but also emphasizing actually a wider range of skills that it thinks ought to be encouraged, that need to be developed within that professional body, and a particular emphasis on the future horizon, on the longer term, and the need to ensure that that the kind of longer term time horizon is taken very seriously, is incorporated within policy development, and that skills are developed appropriately to support that element. But the current context is, of course, that delivery is proving very difficult everywhere. Obviously, there is a particular debate in the Irish context that you all know much better than I do about what is it? What are the blockers? What are the obstacles to the successful and efficient and rapid execution of key central government objectives? And in some of that discourse, as you well know, there is a linkage that's been suggested between the inability of governments to execute mandates quickly and effectively and rising levels of citizen frustration. And I'll come back to that point shortly. Obviously, some of you will be familiar with the article produced by Collison here on the right, which a very powerful critique of in his argument, sort of the bloated sense of the Irish public administration, the development of too many arm's length bodies, too many veto players, and particular focus on the lack of successful execution of large infrastructure projects. Different approach, which I know has been much debated lately, an interesting set of blogs by Sinead O'Sullivan, focusing in a way on the opposite, what she sees as the opposite problem, which is the lack of a development of institutional capacity around around the Irish core executive, and the lack of institutions which have the sort of track record and the ability and the capacity to deliver on the priorities of government. So two very different views there, and I know there are many others. I think in that debate, which I've certainly been tracking this side of the pond, there's a lot of emphasis on the role of judicial review as a particularly important potential blocker, and indeed the structural question that Collison talks about, the proliferation of independent regulatory agencies and other non-department bodies. And there's obviously a distinctive feature of this debate in Ireland, which concerns the particular the fiscal position Ireland is in, and it's the sort of underlying sort of economic model which is at stake in the Irish context. But I am very struck as somebody who's talking to governments in different parts of the world and tracking these debates and very interested in my own research and questions about central government reform. I'm just struck that to me, it feels like similar notes are being struck almost everywhere. And this question about why is it that central government is not performing, is not, particularly when it comes to delivery and implementation, has become a sort of major issue in pretty much all parts of the democratic world. Some of you may be familiar with this book here, Abundance, which in the US context focuses particularly on the Democrats and links some of these sort of perceived problems to the approach Democrats have taken in government. But there are equally other studies that suggest that this is not just a party political point, that actually you can see some of these weaknesses in pretty much all democratic systems. So the factors that get highlighted here is on whether bureaucracy has become overly geared to focus on process and procedure and is just not sufficiently connected to or focused upon measuring and emphasizing outcomes and ensuring that the outcomes that actually are informing key policies are being delivered on. And that's, I think, led to a further debate about whether there is a particular deficit in terms of central government capability in relation to large-scale infrastructure projects and the different component parts, if that's broken down to facets like procurement. I mean, a very big debate here in the UK about whether the civil service is actually equipped to do the kind of to approach procurement in sufficiently professional and coherent a manner. That debate's happening elsewhere, but also in other parts of the chain of activity associated with implementation, not least financial management. So a pretty similar set of concerns breaking out everywhere. And then the point I've mentioned before, is there a linkage here to the evidence of rising citizen frustration? And is it the case that actually it's government's failure to deliver properly and effectively and swiftly that is actually one of the root causes of that very palpable trend? I just happened to see this just as I was putting this talk together, and I thought this sort of illustrated quite neatly the point I want to make about this being an issue everywhere. I don't know if you can, if it's coming out big enough. The writing on this, this was I think put on Blue Sky by the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Darren Jones, who just tweeted out here, as you may know, whilst we're in the midst of a very intense political crisis that's happening in terms of around the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and some challenges emerging to his position. So this is Chief Secretary of the Treasury announcing in rather low-key fashion that actually there will be delivery units established across each department within Whitehall. Now, that's an interesting thing, I guess, to be focusing on at this point in time when the political storm is absolutely breaking. It says something about the deep concern within British government about perceived failures in terms of implementation. It also is interesting for those of you that know a bit about the history of these debates in the UK, and I think this has resonance in the Irish context because it represents another iteration of a pretty endless debate about whether implementation should be the responsibility of departments, or should implementation in fact be more directly overseen and driven from the centre of government. Now, Interestingly, here, this appears to be a lurch in the former direction to empowering different departments to do more when it comes to thinking about implementation. I have to say, my initial observation about this, perhaps I'm a bit jaded, but is that what he's proposing is really quite small beer. I think we're talking about tiny units that would be added on, sort of incremental additions to existing departmental structures. And as far as I'm aware, no new money allocated to support that initiative. So why? Let's come back to I suppose the million dollar question really here is what is it that is making the delivery challenge so acute in the current moment? I'm sure those of you with a good historical understanding will may well be thinking, well, he's talking as if all of this stuff is brand new and haven't we had some of these issues before? And I think that is undoubtedly true. And there have been different moments in different states when there has been quite an intense focus on delivery and perceived obstacles. But I do think the current moment is very distinctive and really quite unusual for the following reasons. I'm just going to skate over a very large landscape here. I think one of the really, or perhaps the most distinguishing feature of the current crisis is that there are so many different crises, so many different challenges that are coming together. They are coalescing in ways that are creating huge instability for governments right across the board, across a whole range of domestic and obviously foreign policy areas all at the same time. So obviously we have the current international conflict. We've for some while been seeing established assumptions about security and where states like Ireland look to for their security, the guarantors of that security. That issue has become very live, given changes in the US in particular, but also now in the European context, the debate that's really getting up in earnest about European defence capability. Energy, arguably, is the rising cost of energy and risks to energy supply is becoming one of the hardest issues. I think one of the wickedest problems for governments to handle. Plus, all at the same time, the cost of living crisis, and not just things like the inflation shock and rising prices, but the sense that governments are now vulnerable in a way that they have not been for some while to developments, to shocks happening in other parts of the world. And obviously the Strait of Hormuz, this narrow waterway and the vulnerability in terms of the world's economy and supply chains, that particular as place has highlighted, and there are many others besides. These are really difficult issues, I think, for government to be grappling with at any time. Since the 2010s, if you look at the data, we can see that not only has trust has fallen in terms of attitudes to governments pretty much everywhere, but actually, arguably, what citizens want from government has also been changing. And to put it simply, expectations have undoubtedly grown. And they've grown, I think, in part because actually there is a growing insecurity amongst many citizens about whether they are going to be able to access social goods that they or their families or their parents would have taken for granted 20, 30 years ago. I think that sense of decline and that it's actually getting incredibly difficult and that you may feel really vulnerable about your own economic position and are increasingly worried about whether at the same time you and your children are going to be able to access those key goods like housing. I think has become a really palpable part of the citizen distrust, one of the really driving forces of it. And then I think behind all of that, or maybe linking all this together, is a sense that you see right across Europe that in some fundamental sense, parts of the population, I don't think it's everyone, but some parts of the population feel that the older contract that existed between state and citizen is really starting to break down. And that the expectations you could once have of government, how it would protect you, what would provide, may no longer still work in the current arena, in the current moment. And I think there is a linkage here to something that's I think is a very strong feeling. You can see it, something that is particularly geographically rooted in many countries, perhaps a little bit less in Ireland, certainly strong in the UK and places like France, which is a feeling in that outside the large cities where economic growth has been maintained or where growth is stronger. But the belief in many people in rural parts of the countries or in towns or in hinterland areas that actually central government is just not listening. It is not sufficiently engaged with the concerns and the challenges facing citizens in their everyday lives. Then add on to all of that is a sense that a lot of evidence that many citizens feel that they think that their own government has either given away powers or is being overly impeded by forces like the courts or indeed by supranational bodies, which mean that governments are no longer able to execute the sorts of things that people would like them to be able to do. So that's we've seen the return of sovereignty pretty much everywhere as a very kind of powerful and destabilizing issue. So that's a very long story, which I've condensed. Two impacts of that, which I think are pretty much palpable everywhere, and I think are the key context for the debate around delivery. One is, excuse me, that there is, I think, there's a growing pressure on what I would call two of the key axes which shape modern governance. One is the relationship between ministers and civil servants, particularly senior civil servants. And we've seen in many different countries, Ireland included, really quite a shift in the tenor of that relationship, whereby the what some people call the public service bargain, the older idea that ministers would take the flak in public when things went wrong, and that civil servants would remain anonymous, but their role was to provide support for the execution of the mandate of ministers and of the larger government. That sense of how the relationship worked feels like it started to break down in many different countries. I think primarily as ministers who are politicians are really starting to feel under huge pressure from rising citizen expectations and growing frustration. And some of those sentiments are being channeled into the system, and we see that increasing emphasis on, well, it's the civil service that have blocked me or that have failed to deliver the things that I promised to do. So there's perhaps a little bit of blame shifting, but I think there's a bigger issue here about a slightly different perception of what the relationship, what the role of the civil service should be in systems like Ireland's and the UK's. It's happening differently in different places, and I'm not suggesting this is an iron law, but I think the context for minister civil servant relationships does feel like it's shifted. And I just put on the slide here an image, very recent image of Ollie Robbins, some of you may recognise from his. He was a very senior civil servant involved in the UK's Brexit negotiations, back in the news very recently because he was sacked by the Prime Minister, blamed for the whole kind of saga around whether Peter Mandelson's vetting should have been, whether his clearance should have been given, and was the Prime Minister told about this? This is just a classic example of somebody who effectively, to all intents and purposes, did his job, as he proved at this very interesting hearing that he gave, parliamentary hearing, but yet was the fall guy. Blame had to be directed somewhere, and that I think is a kind of very dramatic illustration of that trend. Then I think in vertical terms, the relationship between central government and citizen has also, I think, been changed quite fundamentally by the pressures, the dynamics I'm describing here. And I think we begin to see from the 2010s work differently. I think Ireland is a slightly different case because of your slightly different economic story, but pretty much everywhere you begin to see this sort of welling up of a sense of frustration and growing distrust. And Arguably, I think what that creates is a sort of vicious cycle whereby governments feel increasingly beleaguered and detached from or worried about what citizens are thinking, but somewhat incomprehending about it, and in some ways are turning towards increasingly technocratic ways of thinking and hoping that if they can actually sort arrange themselves differently and deliver in technical terms more effectively, maybe that will actually address some of the root causes of citizen frustration. Just a quick look. I'll just touch on this very briefly, just snippets of some trust data I've got. I've got more of this if anyone's interested. This is fairly recent OECD data, it's comparative data on trust in government. And I use this because it shows that there is great variation here. Ireland on that data is actually not doing it as badly. On that slide, you want to be nearer the bottom than the top. And certainly doing better than some other European countries, less well than others. And then you see over time, there have been some really quite marked trends in terms of trust, both in government and the legislature, and that you see a particular movement, I think, in opinion, around 2010, 2011, and then something of a kind of stabilization after. So this is not a sort of dramatic rise in distrust, but overall, this is probably not where any government would want to be in terms of having that nearly 50% of its citizens say they don't trust government, they don't trust Doyle. And then there's a point of comparison here between data between 2021 and 2023, which does suggest that. So the blue column there is trust, that trust has fallen in all the core institutions. And I think less so in terms of political parties. And I think that is an important and interesting distinction there, that actually you see a slightly different pattern in most countries to the trust data around politicians as compared to government. So what do I take out from that brief kind of analysis of these bigger questions and issues? I mean, I think my overall conclusion would be that, governing in a low trust environment is the new normal. This is here to stay for some while. It may be that there are things that can be done to address citizen discontent, and particularly to tackle some of the policy questions linked to that. Of course, that's entirely possible and hopefully will happen. But it's unlikely that the dial is going to be shifted in a fundamental way anytime soon. And I think that we're set in a kind of cultural moment where the perception, the ingrained perception of many citizens is that politicians promise lots of things and then consistently fail to deliver. So one way, the points in italics here are the kind of suggestions, really, the challenges on, what can we do about this? I mean, there's a really interesting piece here about expectations. Can expectations of what government can do be recalibrated or better addressed? And something I'll come back to is implementation and its challenge as much about framing as it is about execution. I think the second point here is really important, which is that I think polling shows that citizens are not stupid. They realize that there are some issues that government is facing, could be the economy, it could be even the housing challenge, which they know are complicated and difficult, and they are in what we might call wicked in character. But I think with those, in relation to those challenges, there's a really interesting question for governments about whether, when it's working on to those really bigger picture challenges, they're going to take a longer time. Are there quicker wins? Are there things it can do earlier on in the policy cycle to demonstrate that it is actually starting to deliver? And is there more that governments, and I think particularly this is about politicians, can do to help citizens understand the trade-offs that are at the heart of of all wicked policy problems? A general view, which the polling is very clear on, is that both public and indeed politicians think that the bureaucracy is not doing its job is actually is in many ways too much of an obstacle rather than an aid to the execution of democratic policy mandates. Which brings us, I think, back to the kind of internal debate, which is the focus of the three pillars framework about, what have governments been thinking within their own systems, what kind of conversations are going on, and what kind of capabilities can be and should be addressed, which might actually contribute to a wider system response to these challenges. I think the very big question here, which every country is going to have to answer in its own way, and I think it is a democratic an issue for the people as well as much for the system of government, is whether this implementation issue is about systems of government, whether things are set up in ways that frustrate coherent delivery, or is it about the people who are tasked with doing the delivering and the implementing? And that, it seems to me, is just a fundamental sort of meta question here. For those who think that there is a system or an institutional aspect to this, I think that one question is whether actually central governments are carrying too heavy a load. Is it the case that actually governments, whilst maybe formally having a whole bunch of powers and responsibilities over key areas, may actually lack some of the institutional and strategic capabilities and tools to deal with policy challenges, particularly in areas where there is particularly complicated and fragmented governance systems and many stakeholders. I think health is perhaps the sort of classic example of that kind of area. So is there an issue there? In terms of thinking about whether the right kinds of institutional capabilities have been developed in relation to different policy areas. And I think that's a question that I see being asked and agonized over in many different governments. I think there's a slightly different aspect to the institutional question, which is about thinking about the relationship between different. There's been a lot of focus on the relationship between government and stakeholders and NGOs and non-departmental bodies. But what about different levels of government? Are there productive kinds of relationship partnerships with other tiers of government, which central government should invest more heavily in? And both in order to actually help it with implementation challenges where appropriate, because often governments, be it city level or local level in the Irish context, may be better placed, better equipped to understand the local challenges, the context, which can really impact on whether a policy will be successfully implemented. And then I think vice versa. I mean, there is, in some context, I think Ireland is one, a question about whether there are local political issues actually flow upwards and can end up being something that clogs up the execution of central government policy. And so what are the mitigators that might be put in place for that is, I think, a big issue. Sorry. And then more generally, just the kind of capability question for the bureaucracy as it exists now. But one particular point I would like to highlight, having read the three pillars framework, is a question back, I think, to the Irish system is what is the right distribution of skills across your governance landscape? And whether you see implementation skills as in part something, I can see that there's an emphasis here on skilling people up across the policy profession in some related implementation aspects, but are there certain parts of implementation that are just distinctive in terms of the skill set required, be it in terms of procurement or large project management? And actually, is it better in some ways to think about a kind of ecological approach that has both generalist and specialist skills operating in alignment within it? Very briefly, I think part of my remit here was to talk a bit about what the academic literature says about implementation that might be helpful. And I've done that really difficult thing of trying to distill this into one slide. So apologies. It's very much a kind of top level overview and lots of these points, I'm sure all these points could be nuanced or indeed questioned by other perspectives. But it seems to me that within the academic debates, there is now a very strong consensus that implementation should not be seen as a purely technical execution set of issues, but is actually often the most complicated and contested part of the policy making process. And politics is absolutely at the heart of implementation, as well as competing views around social interests and different kinds of stakeholder influence being exercised as policy is implemented. And I think that's just a very important note to bear in mind in thinking about how you would skill up civil servants around implementation. I think there's a growing focus too on the importance of evaluation, which I notice is also in your three pillars framework and is really welcome. And the kind of non-linear aspect of the need to ensure that if you do evaluate, then making sure there are feedback loops that knowledge, those findings can get back into the development, the ongoing iterations of a policy as it's developed and as it's being implemented. And this other term, street level bureaucrats, which is the kind of famous study of which is pictured here on the right by Lipsky, which is really the point that's probably very familiar to you all, which is that those people who are on the front line, be it teachers, doctors, people working in front line roles, are the people who, in many ways, will shape what a policy means to the wider public. So that aspect of implementation is also absolutely key, and good policy development ensures that there are dotted lines from high level design right down to an understanding of the contexts, the situations in which street level bureaucrats are operating. And again, feedback loops and ensuring that these things, this knowledge flows around the system seems to be a kind of condition for effective policy making. And then outcomes. I think, again, we'd probably all agree on this. It's easy to say, hard to do, but to really make sure central government designs policy around outcomes that can be broken down into measurable different objectives, and to track those and feed back into government, the sort of higher level of government, the executive function, if those objectives are not being met, and an understanding of why. And then a final point, which maybe is sort of stating the obvious, but I think it is just worth reiterating, is that, overall, my sense of the sort of literature around what makes policy implementations successful, which are the systems where that seems to happen more consistently. And it is perhaps unsurprisingly those where there is higher levels of trust in governing government institutions, and where there is a track record of delivering well, even over sort of fairly basic, less complicated aspects of policy. So building up that track record, demonstrating you can deliver over some maybe more tractable issues, and conveying that to the public seem to be really important elements of success. The element I wanted to just move as I move towards the close, just highlight, because I think this goes back to something I said earlier about strategy, is I think the importance of a strategic thinking about the question of where does strategy lie in the strategic capabilities within any existing central government. I mean, this is a debate I'm sure you're familiar with. Mostly it's a debate that is seen as almost the polar opposite of implementation, as the thing that, oh, you think about strategy within your core executive, or when you're thinking at a very high level about challenges that are coming down the line and the big questions facing the government and the country. Well, actually, I think it's a mistake to think about strategy and implementation as unrelated or as fundamentally different in kind. Better implementation, I think, is often contingent upon more strategic approaches to policy making. So there is a link, I think, between all those debates that you'll be familiar with about how to build a strategic function in central government, often associated with various kinds of strategic policy inputs. Very good recent paper here, which is I've given the cover of Governing in Turbulent Times by Jeff Mulgan from the UK, which is just a kind of overview of different countries and their different ways of institutionalizing, attempting to institutionalize a more strategic element within the governing process. I think the reason I would bring these two together and argue that it's worth thinking about them in a more connected, joined up way is that actually decision makers are need to understand that when they are dealing with policy issues, they are dealing with issues that present across different time horizons. There are some policy challenges that are just going to take a longer time, either to understand or to kind of corral the right kinds of mix of expertise, technical knowledge, and policy tools than others which present themselves more immediately or which may be more tractable to more immediate solutions or at least mitigations. And actually, a strategic sensibility, a strategic sense of those policy issues enables you to kind of make those decisions about time frame and the length of time over which you ought to be working on different issues. And particularly the classic mistake there, I think, is to see the implementation challenge across those different policy areas as in some sense the same. It's not. It is really quite different, I think, across the different kinds of issue areas that you'll be thinking about in any central government. That's a tee up really for a longer conversation. I'd be very happy to discuss that further with anyone interested. I think the other point about implementation I would make to finish is that implementation is not just about technical delivery and execution and better data. It is often about those things, but it is a much about making citizens understand the change that's been made and be able to see the dotted line between something that they may experience as hopefully an improvement or something that's new and something that was actually delivered and developed and delivered by central government. And that policy success, more generally, I think is something we often just do not focus on or talk about enough. That's as true, I think, in policy schools. I mean, something that we're thinking about hard here in our teaching and training. We've noticed how much we tend to use disasters and failures to teach our students how to be better policymakers. Well, we should be talking more about the things that worked and about the success stories and sort of distilling some of the knowledge and insight from that, but so too in government. I think it's really important. And indeed, back into the political system, it's really important that we learn as much from what worked, even if by solving or addressing a problem, it has actually taken it off the political agenda, and citizens may even have forgotten who was responsible for it and why. I think bringing those narratives back to the surface and thinking about the wraparounds when policies are implemented and executed is also an integral part of addressing the implementation challenge. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope some of that's been useful or of interest or maybe at least has provoked thoughts, even disagreement. Just to repeat, really sorry not to be with you today. And here's my email if any of you would like to follow up. Thank you very much for listening to me.